Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As is always, it's my pleasure to have back with me today Charles Hugh Smith, well followed and extremely prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Welcome back, Charles. I hope you've been safe in Hawaii.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to our complex but important topics today.
Charles, before we begin, as I normally do, I need to stress with our new viewers that this is not an interview. We do these videos as a way of us productively dialoguing the important trends we are identifying and simply make these discussions available to the public for those that might be interested or want to contribute constructive comments, which we really very much welcome. Today we're going to focus on the extremely serious problems facing city and local governments in the United States specifically. As such, we hope to cover the subject areas I have listed here on the agenda sheet. We have a significant number of slides to share, and therefore we'll move along quickly. So let's just jump right in on today's discussion. Charles, before we begin, any comments as an overview here?
No, I would just say that what we're talking about is a series of dominoes that are falling, and as a result of the pandemic being a catalyst. It's not really the cause of the problems, but it was the catalyst that tipped over the first domino, and now all the other dominoes are falling.
Exactly. That's why I wanted to start here with kind of a situational analysis before we lead into, the pandemic itself is going to lead to at the state and the local, at this level of government. Before I even do that, we need to put a few things in for perspective in helping us understand the problems facing small town America, or what is, I said, referred to as city and local government. And that is, first of all, the federal government is not, well, at least not yet, bailing out state governments, and is only addressing municipal governments, addressing them with maximum 36-month term loans. There's no gift here. These are only loans that they're willing to make, and only to those with investment grade ratings, which means they're payable and they have to be paid back. And the money must be paid back in a maximum of 36 months. Now, that doesn't mean some of this might not be changed. Matter of fact, you can almost expect it to be changed, but that's the current guidelines. And then secondly, the lenders must be cities with over 250,000 citizens or counties with over 500,000 residents. And as the charts at the bottom shows, this covers a maximum number of eligible borrowers of only 87 cities and 140 counties, which actually totals about half the population from a electorate in these cities and counties that will be covered. But you've got to be a very large city or county to actually qualify. So there's really basically no money for municipal, small governments, or what I call small town America. They're not small towns. We were talking about places below 250,000 citizens. There's no assistance from the Federal Reserve for state government, as I just said. So there's no money that can flow from the state. Where are they going to get it from? Now, there may be change, but right now the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, is absolutely vehement that he wants, because he's concerned about insolvency of many states, and is adamant that the Senate won't open that bottomless pit, and it would be a bottomless pit. And we've talked about this, Charles, because of pensions. So there won't be money passing from the states down. So we have got basically small town America that have got expenses going out, but won't have any money coming back in. So I wanted to make sure we understood that, because we might start thinking, well, they're going to get bailed out. Now, things may change, but we've already, upped the Federal Reserve balance sheet by $4 trillion. We're probably on our way to a $7 trillion, or 6.5 now, a $10 trillion balance sheet. And we pumped out through 4 phases now nearly $2.5, $3 trillion at the fiscal level. We'll have a $4 trillion deficit this year in the fiscal budget. So, how much more money is there going to be available? And the problem we're talking about here, the municipal and local, is huge. So any comments on any of that so far, Charles?
No, I'm just looking at your slide, the situational analysis, where you where you describe the situation pre-COVID-19. In other words, all these obligations existed long before the pandemic. Now the question is, how are these local governments going to pay for these obligations?
Exactly. The slide says crippling pension obligations that are facing these local governments, police, fire, teachers, and they have no control over these, at least in the Northeast. These are unions at the state level that control standard contracts, retirement plans for the pensions, and the local towns have to live with them, and they can't afford it. They truly can't, and they haven't been putting monies aside. They know that. They're staring down the gun barrel of massive issues with pension before this happened, and cash flows that go with it, and abilities that they're seeing, have already seen, of citizens actually to meet the current tax assessments and mill rates. And nothing is going up faster than property taxes right now. And of course, everybody's got a large home, and so they're really getting hit. But at what point can't the housing absorb the tax rates? And as we were talking about earlier, we got people, their tax on their house is $27,000 a year, and their Social Security is going to be $22,000 or something like that. So how do they retire with no pension? These are the problems we're already facing. And they have deficits, but they can't fund the deficits. They can't borrow money for operating costs. They can only borrow it for infrastructure. And that's one of the things they've been doing, is no infrastructure of any magnitude is being spent, and no maintenance, so it's just getting worse. And have been playing, as this current situation, they're using the Illinois model, and that is, give out future pension numbers that are too rich to avoid having to increase costs today. And the unions say, okay, fine, we'll take this on the pensions, but we'll only ask for a 5 or 6% increase as opposed to the 12% we are going to shut you down. So they get it both ways, but these pensions are now coming due. These juice pensions, if I can call them. And of course, then there's this whole allure of debt, where instead of saving for a rainy day, we don't do that. When money's cheap, it's called, oh, fine, but now money might not be cheap. If you can get it, who's going to lend the money if the economies are really slowing dramatically? So this is what we're facing. So now we have the lockdown here. So what we're seeing, the residents that can't pay their monthly rents, they can't pay their mortgage, their car payments, and what's critically important, those who own can't pay quarterly property taxes. So suddenly you've got all of these liabilities that you're having to pay. You're the one that has responsibility for all the first responders, the fire, the police, the emergency measures, etc. And your teachers, you're still paying them, but you don't have any money coming in. So the cash flow is now hitting quite a significant rate. The result of it is, as of right now, they're all facing massive cash flow problems. The issue with revenues, as it's showing here, is where do they get their money? And it varies by state, but the small towns generally, primarily, they live off property taxes and state government grants, which have been getting thinner and thinner. So it's just the property taxes and what's going to happen there. And the cities themselves, still property taxes, but there's a little bit more sharing with sales tax, capital gains, and payroll taxes that flows down from the state levels. So there's no one fits all across all of the states, but primarily property taxes are absolutely critical, and that gets into real estate. Now, Charles, I've got up a chart here that really has some of the key points that you've been talking about that you see going ahead that are going to really impact what I've just talked about.
Right. And these are, again, trends that Gordon and I have discussed for years, and that the decline of local retail, which is a big source for the sales tax, right? And the shrinking need for office and commercial space, and the overbuilding that's occurred across much of America in terms of huge expanses of commercial and office space, just as business is going online, and now we're working from home. And Gordon, you mentioned the slowing home ownership, which we've talked about in the generational demographic analysis, that the millennial generation simply doesn't have income, nor does it have the desire to buy the McMansions that the boomer generation is selling. And then the other source of property tax is rental properties, right? Which there's been a huge expansion of rental housing as the home ownership rates have slowed. And Gordon, maybe you can describe the impact of all that, the hundreds of thousands of subsidized housing units that have been built on local government revenues.
Yeah, it's a problem that gets very little visibility because, as you said, the millennials are not buying housing for whatever reasons. It's a whole discussion we've had before, but they're not. They're renting, and where they choose. Now, what's happening is because all of these towns are now being and municipalities are being forced to have a certain level of subsidized housing, and it's quite substantial actually. In our area, it's 20% of all occupancy has to be available for subsidized housing. So all these apartment buildings are going up just literally everywhere. Now the problem with the apartment buildings is their rents are very, very high, but the people living in them are all being subsidized by state, federal grants or by at the state level. So they're not paying if they're in our area. A lot of them are $3,000 and $4,000 a month and higher. They're not paying anything or very minimal based on their ability to pay and what they're allowed to. Now, I'm not picking on that as a problem. What I am saying is that the towns, they get some money for the property taxes for these apartment buildings, but it pales in comparison to all the services that they then have to supply in the towns. So it means more teachers, more fire, more police, more other kinds of services, public works, sewers, etc., that all have to be financed and put in, and there's just not enough cash to do it. So the vast majority are fighting tooth and nail. They don't want these because they can't afford them, but they're being forced at them. And the bottom line is it's hitting their budgets, and they can't go out and force up the mill rates on housing that's already crippling a lot of, as I said earlier, the taxpayers. So these are the subtle things that unless you sit in a town meeting across America, you don't realize what the town managers and the kinds are now facing, and nobody's bailing them out in any way. And they're eroding right at the center.
Right. And the other, just to go back to commercial real estate and the potential impact on property taxes and local revenues is you mentioned the slide here, the Zoom workplace. And, the lockdown has forced, I wouldn't say forced, I would say it has magnified or accelerated a trend that was already well in place, which was corporate America um, allowing many of its key employees to work from home, right? To work remotely, and this lowers costs across the board, right? In other words, the employees don't have to waste 2 hours commuting, and the employer doesn't have to pay for a bunch of cubicles and office space. And so that impact is going to be dramatic because corporate America, as you and I were discussing before we started recording, has to cut costs because of the uncertainties of the economy ahead, right? And we don't know what's going to happen. And so in an era of uncertainty, you've got to slash your expenses first because you're not going to survive if you don't do that. So how is it going to be that we're going to go back and fill up all these empty commercial buildings when small businesses under such pressure and corporations and companies realize they can keep their expenses lower by using a remote workforce, at least in all the work that's done staring at a screen, right? So obviously the people who are working at the water treatment plant and repaving the roads, they're going to still be out and about in the real world, but a huge amount of the service sector can be done online. So what's going to happen when these big buildings are vacant? and who's going to be paying the property tax on a building that's losing money? And so I see a huge wave of foreclosures and defaults on commercial real estate, and that will eventually impact property taxes.
It's already happening in bigger centers. New York City is a classic. No question, you drive around America, the office space for rent is the standard sign. They're everywhere. And that's been with us for quite some time. And now you've got this dramatic shift. We well know about it in the retail space because of everything's went online. So, a lot of these storefronts are simply empty or minimal. But the office space itself has been there, and now with the Zoom economy. And what's been going on, I'll call it, the corporates are now changing, as you just outlined, but the service sector, and it's something I really see, they've stopped using offices. No matter what service it seems, whether they're landscapers, contractors, kitchen contractors, roofer contractor, whatever, they will all tell you they don't have an office. They run it off their cell phones. And they have an answer. They're on site, or they're traveling around, or they're sitting in a coffee shop doing their business. That's where their office is, because it reduces dramatically their costs. Oh, they may have an answering machine as such, but their accounting, they've got an accountant that's doing it. So what used to be you'd have to have an office, those days aren't there. I know the office building I was in, it just slowly all just disappeared. And now we've got what you're calling the Zoom economy, and there's more and more of that, and people working out of their housing. So where the primary income of these towns is in property tax. So if they got a housing issue we talked about, and facing it, and all of the costs to support that, the housing is now subsidized, and then you've got, whether it's the retail commercial space or office space, they already got killed because the factories that moved out years ago and are all still vacant or were turned into apartment buildings. It's a real problem right across America.
Right, and then just moving on to small business, which is again a major source of tax revenue for local governments, right? Well, most small businesses nowadays are service sector, and they're facing, as we discussed last year, soaring costs for rent, regulatory compliance, insurance, wages, healthcare, fees, taxes. So they're they're really under the gun because their costs have continued to rise just relentlessly, but they cannot raise prices, and that there's pushback from consumers who are struggling with the same issue. So big corporate America goods producers have responded to this with shrinkflation, meaning that you've noticed that all the packages of cold cereal and everything. I mean, the boxes are now so thin they won't even stand up by themselves. Have you noticed that? The box is only 1.25 inches wide now, so it falls over because they've shrunk the box to keep the price the same. And but with local and small business services, how do you shrink a haircut or a latte? I mean, you can't. And you need a certain number of labor hours to run your business, and so there's just no way that you can escape this crunch. Now they're facing huge reductions in their business, and as you mentioned before we started recording, there's a lot of regulatory discussion here about restaurants have to remove seating, to keep social distancing, and as you said, that they were barely able to keep their head above water when they were running at 90 to 100% of capacity. And if they have to try to run at 50%, there's just no way. They're going to have to close.
And especially if people are a little bit resistant of going back when the lockdown is removed and sitting in an environment where they feel unsafe. And that's going to be, they're going to have to be very creative to convince people that it is safe, and that in fact and they can make a go of it with existing infrastructure that they have. It's a real problem, and all of these small towns, they live off these small businesses. They very much so, whether they're restaurants or hair salons or whatever kinds of service sector, and they just can't they can't cut anymore. And that actually leads to Charles, a big, just as big an issue that I'm seeing in all these local towns is that we've had this massive explosion. I call them cookie cutters, and that is everything's a franchise today. And whether it's fat, let's just pick on fast foods. It goes right across with muffler changes or whatever. And if you go to any town in America, they're starting to all look the same. And what's key here is, yeah, they pay some taxes in there, but the money doesn't stay in the town. And for years and years, a lot of these towns, they really survived not out of just the tax revenue, but it was like the local businessman who owned the pharmacy. Doesn't anymore. It's owned by CVS and Walgreens, etc. Or owned the shoe store. Not anymore. It's Payless or whatever. Or owned whatever kind of small business merchant. They owned it. They paid their taxes, but they, more importantly, they all typically belonged to a service club, whether it was the Kiwanis, the Lions clubs, the Rotary Club. It goes on, and they were all, every town was very proud. It went in. They had 6 or 7 service clubs, and these service clubs raised money. They were active. They raised money for pools, for parks, areas that things needed to be brought up to date as projects, and fundraising to do it. And that took out a huge amount. Well, it created a lot of pride in the towns for starters, but it took out a lot of the costs that allowed the towns to really survive and do well. That doesn't happen anymore. These franchises, even the people working in them are commuting to them. So there's no loyalties to the town. The only thing that they do supply is some tax revenue. But in a lot of cases, they won't move in unless they're giving real good tax breaks to be able to do it. So there's the bigger issue, as I said, it's just this whole loss of the small businessman and what they do versus just paying their taxes. Does that make sense to you, Charles? Have you seen the same thing?
Oh yeah, and I think you've hit on a point that people just do not fully understand, although they see it and they experience it, is that a cookie cutter town with huge numbers of empty storefronts, and then you see a chain outlet every once in a while. It removes what it does is it stripped away all the social capital in the local economy, which is like an ecosystem, right? In other words, if there's a fun, lively district with a high variety of businesses, that's what is a magnet for people. A place that's walkable, that there's interesting shops and various kinds of restaurants. And once that's lost, because it's no longer financially feasible to operate a business like that, a small business, then all you have is empty storefronts and a really ugly chain outlet with poor quality food and goods. And so it's like that's just not the same. So and of course it feeds on itself. That if you lose the variety and resilience of your local economy and you're left with just some corporate chains, then it's almost impossible to rebuild Main Street because there's nobody walking around anymore. Let's say a city or a county, their tax revenues are down by $10 million, and then they're now faced with they have to pay their pension requirements because that's mandated by the state. And then, so the only thing they can do is cut services, which means reduce library hours or close libraries, stop maintaining the schools, and on and on and on, all taking it out of the hide of people, of the residents. So what's going to be the solution is, well, okay, maybe the federal government will give them the 10 million, right? And then so that'll solve the problem for a year. But meanwhile, that won't solve the long-term problem, which is their tax revenue base, the foundation, the source of all their tax revenues has taken a permanent hit, in property taxes, the loss of small business, and so on. The magnitude is beyond belief. The 10 million is only, that's 1 year. So what about the next 10 or 20 years? Are you going to be bailing out each municipality as their tax revenues continue to decline because of the feedback loops we've described today? It's like it's not going to work. And so that crisis is going to face every municipality and every resident of every city and county. we're seeing a lot of technological adoptions that were accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, right? I like to say work from home. And we're seeing similar advances in like teleservice of healthcare and online learning and so on. So I think we have the potential, if we accept, if we kind of grasp the nettle, we can greatly improve the productivity of our economy if we basically renovate or allow innovation to take down the cartels and monopolies that dominate most of the American economy. So if we actually use the technologies that are available and break the grip of entrenched interests who are benefiting from this sort of sclerotic, unproductive status quo, then we can become a much more productive economy, which means everybody gets more prosperous.
That's how we get more prosperous, is being more productive. And a lot of the
Right.
things that are happening right now are things that will force us to use technology more effectively. And we're incented, which is good. Bringing back industries is good. These are all could lead to just tremendously positive things if we approach them the right way. Papering it over
Right.
by just handing out free goodies on loans, as you correctly point, does not solve the problems longer term. So there's a balance
No.
in there. And do we have the leadership to find out? And then we'll see that. I'm a little negative in the short term, and it'll take another crisis or two to see whether the politicians start to deliver the kinds of leadership that has been missing here for so long. Because a lot of these problems that we're into was simply the policy of kicking a can down the road, right? Just avoiding the real problems and
Right. And that
not addressing and waiting for a crisis and then reacting when everybody's afraid and are willing to sacrifice anything to get back to the status quo. And that's, a true and pride approach of any politician. Don't raise the issue until it's a crisis and then propose something that you wanted all along.
Well, my final comment, Gordon, is just to reiterate what you've already said, which is, printing 3 trillion, 6 trillion, 12 trillion, 20 trillion, 40 trillion, 100 trillion. That history has no examples of that succeeding. It only destroys your currency, and then everybody that depended on that currency is wiped out. So if currency loses its value, everybody holding currency loses everything they had. And so that's the only path. That's the only end result of printing endless amounts of money without actually improving your productivity or your production of useful goods and services. And so that's the road we're on. And that's unfortunate, but that's the way it's going to go.
Every generation has to learn the same lessons. And, the generation that learned the great post-1929 stock market and then the 1930s Great Depression have deep stories about things like savings and this sort of thing. They learned, but they're now no longer with us. And we have another generation that's going to learn some very serious lessons, I would suspect. But I'm actually very optimistic, Charles, just in closing comments. I really see that more good can come out of it, but it's gonna take a real shakeup here, and which is what we're going through, because this isn't a U.S. problem. This is a global problem, with a vast majority of developed countries, whether we're talking UK, France, Germany, Japan, they've all got the problems we're talking about and bigger. This is not just an American issue. And when you get this many entitlement countries around the world and you get this kind of problem, it's going to force everybody to face the same issue. You can't all just print endlessly. Though we'll try. Let me make no doubt about that. We will try. And as everybody has said about America, you can be counted on America to do the right thing after it's exhausted every other possible approach. So, so with that, Charles, on that optimistic note, can you tell our listeners where they follow your work?
Yeah, please visit me at of2minds.com. I have free samples of all my recent books, and my archives are free.
Thank you very much, Charles. Talk to you next month, and stay safe.
Okay. Thank you, Gordon.
Bye.